Okay, so next up we have Katrina WIndon from the University of Arkansas. Are you there, Katrina?
I am.
Perfect. Go ahead when you're ready.
Okay. Can everyone see this okay? All right. So as she mentioned, I'm Katrina WIndon. I'm with the University of Arkansas Special Collections, and I'm going to talk a bit about our ArchivesSpace implementation, which happened in conjunction with an offsite storage move last year. And that sort of drove a lot of our deadlines and the way that we decided to involve volunteers and sort of distribute labor. So where we started off at was with our data in 2 different locations and our collections in 2 different locations. And then a lot of that was moving over. So we had more modern accession records were in Archivist Toolkit, and then a lot of legacy data in an InMagic database. So my predecessor, Lily Carroll, had worked with our database administrator to export the InMagic database into a spreadsheet and started doing some very tedious normalization of that data. And so we had the idea at this point that we would use the Archivist Toolkit migration tool for Archivist Toolkit data and then migrate by CSV file for the InMagic data. In addition, we had information about containers that were just in Excel spreadsheet shelf lists. And then we had some other random paper files that weren't really reflected in any of our digital data. And so the general impetus for this planning had been that Archivist Toolkit was no longer being updated. The profession as a whole was moving to Archivist Toolkit. But the real momentum for the project came when the library started planning for a new offsite storage facility that would be governed by an inventory management system based on barcodes, which is not something that the Special Collections Department had used previously, and not something that Archivist Toolkit was really going to support for us with the kind of functionality we needed. So I'm going to talk about this as if these are all discrete stages, but really there was a lot of overlapping going on. So one of the first steps that we did was metadata mapping. And this was primarily for the InMagic data because the Archivist Toolkit was already fairly structured. But InMagic had basically been used with fields as catch-alls as needed and a lot of things just made up to suit temporary needs based on whoever was doing accessioning at a given time. So we did a lot of work trying to find a place for all the data and also to create default values for mandatory data fields that we didn't have any data for. And so one of the biggest complications here was that we had a lot of incomplete donor information, a lot of people who were, for instance, a donor named Mrs. Smith. And so in trying to figure out what the optimal ways to reflect this data were in our migration. Our next step was the vendor selection and requisition. And depending on what kind of institution you work at, this time frame may look long or short to you, and this is actually very much on the short end for our institution. But we were definitely benefiting from the fact that the whole library knew that this move was coming, that there were going to be very tight deadlines in 2018. And so being able to communicate to administrators that our current software wasn't going to support what they needed from us, and that ArchivesSpace would in fact support this was really crucial to us getting this requested, meeting with host vendors, and then getting it ordered in a pretty short turnaround. So we ended up going with Atlas Systems, and I'll mention them throughout as they were a huge help throughout various stages ongoing in our process. So for most of the rest of 2017, we worked on our migration and then reviewing some of the test migrations that Atlas did for us. So making sure that everything was transporting over where we expected it to, and doing some refining, especially with our default values, to make sure that things sorted properly and that the things that we knew we wanted to go back and fix someday were going to be pretty easily identifiable. Also ongoing throughout this was a very large-scale project to convert our legacy finding aids. Previously, we'd had them all stored on a server, but not in Archivist Toolkit or another content management system. And so getting those into ArchivesSpace was going to be pretty important. So to do that, we ended up getting volunteers from several departments across the libraries, including our tech services and our user services, who were very generous in volunteering their time to do some data conversion alongside their regular projects. We used a combination of an in-house web form for collection level information and the steady program for the inventory component of finding aids. Through this, we managed to get through about 500 of our legacy finding aids before the move, which was pretty close to what we were aiming for, but not quite. So we did end up with some skeleton resource records in ArchivesSpace that we're replacing with finding aids as we go forward. And this was an opportunity for us to learn something new about the ArchivesSpace data structure, which is that attaching top containers to a resource record directly works slightly differently when you're trying to get that information back out than if you had attached them to an existing top container from an imported finding aid. So that comes up later as I talk about our SQL queries. And then the other major data entry component of our migration was this top container association. So trying to get container profiles and barcode information attached to all the top containers that would be moving to our new storage facility. So this is another thing where we got volunteers from across the library. We were able to involve about 15 people across 4 library departments. And one of the complications in this was that the ArchivesSpace permission structures mean that if you're going to give someone permission to edit, you also have to give them permission to look at basically anything that isn't a suppressed record. So that did somewhat limit the volunteer involvement we had as opposed to other phases like the EAD conversion. The next phase, which for me was definitely the most complicated, was getting an open database connection set up. So Atlas gave us, they set this up on their end, they gave us access permissions, and then I was able to work with our web services librarian to sort of explore this in my SQL editor and try to figure out what the ArchivesSpace database structure looks like, and particularly how the different tables connected to each other so that we could link things like barcode with a container profile with a location, with a collection title and an identifier. And so this was all necessary because while ArchivesSpace has a lot of great built-in reporting, none of them had every single field that we were going to need for our inventory management system. Each was missing at least one key component. So this open database connection allowed us to run custom reports to get all of the information that we needed. So we run our reports using MySQL, joining a lot of tables together to get out this information that we can then import into our inventory system. So for an inventory management system, we use a program called Caiasoft. And so we import our export from the MySQL as a CSV, and then it matches based on a barcode field that's already been ingested into the inventory management system when they shelve a container. And then this also helps us track circulation to and from the storage facility. So those are some of the sort of discrete stages, and then we've got several ongoing stages, with one of those being data cleanup. There are several projects that we'll probably be doing for several years to come, including deduplicating our agent name fields, coming from 2 different source accession systems. We ended up with a lot of overlaps, particularly things that weren't standardized to LCNA formatting. Also trying to move a lot of things that had been in sort of catch-all general fields into the more specialized and granular fields that ArchivesSpace allows, so that eventually we'll be able to run some better reports and get better understanding of what our data is. And then we're in the middle of the process of updating all the processing statuses of our accession records in ArchivesSpace as well, since that hadn't always been regularly used, and so that'll help us get better understanding of what our remaining backlog is. And another ongoing project for us is developing our documentation. Throughout the process, we created a lot of workflows that we tried to write for an audience of people who might not have any familiarity with archives, so they can get extremely detailed and aren't necessarily what we want to use to train future special collections staff members. But we're using those as a basis to sort of develop our institutional manual for ArchivesSpace. So throughout this project, scaling was an interesting challenge because we were working with 30 to 40 people sometimes at a given time and across departments. Some of the regular workflows that we use within the department, like working on our shared server, weren't very practical because not everyone had the right access permissions. So we did a lot of work with Box, which is our institutional version of Dropbox. And then our libraries were also using Basecamp as a project management tool more generally for move planning. We also ran into a lot of issues with, I guess, people simultaneously trying to edit ArchivesSpace records. So that led us to try to better break down what people should be working on at any given time to try to prevent those issues of two people trying to add and edit top container information for the same collection at the same time. And also, the implementation in general was too large a project for the move-related deadlines. So we prioritized the collections that were being moved, and then the conversion of other EAD finding aids and that sort of thing is going to be ongoing and wasn't as much of a priority initially. So just as some initial numbers, we migrated about 2,600 accession records to start with, barcoded about 22,000 containers and associated their information with records, with more than 30 people across about half a dozen library units participating in some form or fashion. And so the momentum of having this concrete move deadline where the boxes were going to move, we wouldn't be able to access them if they didn't have associated metadata, was really important in us getting this buy-in both in our own department and throughout the libraries. But it also meant we were competing for personnel resources with other library departmental projects that were similarly impacted by the same deadlines. So the physical move happened. There were certainly outstanding issues, but it's the sort of thing that has a very concrete sort of deadline, envisionable and actionable. But the ArchivesSpace implementation is definitely an ongoing process for us that we're going to be improving upon, particularly as we complete our EAD conversion and import. We're hoping to switch to ArchivesSpace as our public user interface for finding aids. And then also that agent deduplication that I mentioned before is going to be one of our upcoming projects. So I think the moderator is going to handle questions, but if there's anything that you think of later and not right now, definitely feel free to email me at any time, and I'm happy to talk about our project.
Thanks so much, Katrina. Yeah, that looks like a very big undertaking. Does anyone have any questions for Katrina? I'm curious about you. So you mentioned that you had over 30 staff, library staff in different units involved in this project. I'm curious how many of those people were actually involved in like touching ArchivesSpace, or I'm curious about the experience of maybe non-archive staff using ArchivesSpace, whether that was something that you had going on. Whether there were different ways you had to train people who were maybe a little bit less conversant in archives?
That's something we had going on and that I would not necessarily recommend, although I'm very appreciative of everyone who tried. So we had about 15 people working in ArchivesSpace directly, 6 of whom were not within the Special Collections Department. And the more previous involvement they had with special collections, the easier it was for them. But cataloging staff in particular, I think, had the most challenges because they were much more used to, I guess, mark and thinking of objects differently. The idea of a top container was surprisingly confusing for some people. For me, I guess. So really trying to explain things more concretely tended to help better than just walking people through the software. So relating to specific collection examples and then walking through examples with people tended to be the most effective.
Thanks. Does anyone else have any questions for Katrina? Looks like something's come in through the chat. So Venkat asks, he says it's slightly tangential, but Katrina, you remarked about user permissions on ArchivesSpace. Oh, this is more of a question for me. And Katrina, maybe you can say whether this would have been something that would have been helpful for you. Wondering if there are any plans to have more granular user permissions and perhaps also allow new users who have very restricted access, such as only new data entry. So I can say just from a program standpoint, we had a staff interface enhancement working group that delivered some really excellent recommendations on a variety of areas related to the user interface. And one of the areas that they delivered some recommendations on was for user permissions and thinking about whether things could be more granular, including whether there was the possibility of setting it up so certain users could only edit certain records. Right now the permissions work in ArchivesSpace so that you can set permissions for users to be able to edit certain types of records, but not individual records themselves or fields within records. So it's definitely something that we know users would like, and we're looking at how maybe in the future that could be implemented. Katrina, did you have any sort of issues around permissions or maybe wishes that you could have permissions work a little bit differently in ArchivesSpace for this project?
So particularly in 2 areas. It would have been nice to be able to restrict people's ability to view agent records, because that was one concern we had in allowing volunteers from across the library, is that we have donor information in our database. And then the other was what you just mentioned, ability to really to permit people not to delete or overwrite things, even if they could create new ones. So we did have someone delete a container profile that ended up being the most traumatic workday of my life. Fortunately, Atlas was able to revert us back to a backed up version of our system, but unfortunately there was no way to let people create a container profile with also letting them delete them.
Okay. Does anyone, and Venkat says thanks, does anyone have any other questions for Katrina? All right, well thank you, Katrina. That was really fascinating, huge project, and we look forward to seeing your slides on the wiki.
Thank you. Thanks for setting this up.